Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a morning show for us in Europe, but an evening show if you're in Australia or New Zealand, or very, very late if you're over in the USA. Because this is a show we do at a different time of day, there may well be new people watching us who've not caught a live stream before. If this is your first live stream, please feel welcome to jump in the comments in the sidebar there. We welcome your participation. It's all part of the process of being a World War II TV member of the family. But anyway, talking of families, back in World War II or after World War II, for families, the difficulty accepting that a loved one is missing in action and a body has not been found is profound. It probably is the hardest way to deal with loss. Bruce M.Petty joins me today to talk about some of the cases from the Pacific that he has studied and been involved in. His website, his books are, of course, linked in the description below. I'll bring him in now. Evening where you are. Good evening, Bruce. How are you today?
Well, I'm still breathing, and it's not too late here. It's about 8 in the evening, so I'm ready to go.
As I said in the top of the show there, for dealing with the loss of someone who's missing, it must be the hardest. And in the USA has missing from numerous wars around the world, as do indeed the Commonwealth. Is it, when you're studying this aspect of World War II, rather than studying a battle per se, does it require an extra kind of level of emotional? Do you have to be detached from it? Is it better to get involved in it? How do you find, just dealing with this subject of the missing from the war?
Well, actually, I fell into this accidentally because back in the 1990s, when I was living in the Mariana Islands and I was researching my book on Saipan, I kept hearing stories from some of the people that I interviewed about, well, so-and-so was killed, but we had to keep moving and we left the body there for graves registration. Well, as I discovered, graves registration during World War II was a bit of a hit and a miss. It was like, I think some of these people were not very well trained. So I came across stories where these individuals knew that one of their buddies was killed, but then they found out later that the families notified that they were missing in action and not killed in action. Mm. And as I discovered from other oral history interviews and other research I did later, that when a family member says, oh, he's missing in action, of course, the hope is, well, he might still be alive then. Maybe he's a POW, or maybe he's on some desert island waiting to be rescued. Even one person I interviewed, his brother was on the Asheville when it was sunk off the coast of Java in February 19 or March, February 42. And his family is notified that he was missing in action. He said his mother lived to be 85 and never gave up hope that her son was still alive someplace. So I'm going to give you some examples here because I've worked on some cases where we still don't have any answers, and a few situations, which I'll show you on the slides, where we did come up with some results. So if you want to get into the slide, and I always start off my presentation with this photograph because I think a lot of your viewers have been to Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu. And if you drive in, there are gravestones right and left. But if you keep going all the way to the back of the cemetery, you'll see these marble structures back there. And if you go and look at them, there are names of Americans still listed as missing in action from World War II. Now, when they solve a case, they put a little rosetta next to the name. Now, if we can go on to the next slide, this just gives you, this is put out by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, which I will refer to as DPAA from now on. But if you look at the graph on the far right, that's the list of all of the Americans that are still listed as missing in action from our various wars going back to, I guess, before World War I. But if you look at the column on the far left, that's how many Americans are still listed as missing in action just from World War II. It's over 70,000. So I describe this as a work in progress because when I was hearing these stories, it wasn't on my list of things to research or write about at the time. But after a while, I kept getting more and more of these stories. And I thought, well, I would really like to write a book about that. But after contacting families of the missing, individuals and groups were actively involved on their own in the search for wreck sites with the hope of finding human remains and being able to identify them. I just realized that I would have to go on the road for an extended period of time at own personal expense. I just had to drop the subject. but I didn't want to drop it completely. So I continued to research it. I'm still in contact with groups and individuals in an effort to at least keep the story alive.
Yeah, and I think keeping the hope alive is part of it, isn't it? And with technology, I mean, I've been involved in a few things over the years. The ability just to communicate with different resources and organizations around the world, because you say there are people in all different fields there, you know, diving and cadaver dogs and people who study the maps, the terrain. It's bringing people together. But we'll plow on. And I love this. I'm glad you showed this photo there, because every single time, Bruce, we do a Pacific show, we kind of remind people just how staggeringly enormous that body of water is and what size area we're talking about. It's, you know, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, like I told you too in a previous podcast, I discovered a lot of people really don't have much knowledge of geography. I don't know if they don't teach it in school anymore. And like I said, there was a study done a few years ago where they tested American high school students on their knowledge of geography. And one of the surprising results that came back was over 50% of them thought they lived in Brazil. So this just gives you how vast the battlefield was. It went all the way up to the Aleutian Islands, down to Papua New Guinea, even Australia, with some Japanese naval activity around the area. If we can move on to the next one. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the MIA cases that I studied from the Mariana Islands. That blue arrow will point you to the Mariana Islands, and then we can go to the next slide. And then this is just a closer up of the Marianas. It's an arc of islands running roughly north to south. The biggest, the oldest is Guam, which is still a U.S. territory. If you go up a ways, you'll see Rota, Tini, and Saipan. That's where I did most of my research and explorations. But islands continue all the way up to Moog, and most of them are uninhabited. They're all volcanic in origin. Some of them are still volcanically active, such as Anatahan up there. It started erupting again back in 2003. We can go on to the next one. And this is the map of Saipan. I took from the official Marine Corps history of the Battle of Saipan. It shows you where the Marines and the Army landed there on the southwest coast. But one of the people I've been networking with is Ted Darcy. He's from, I don't know, it's Vermont, New Hampshire, somewhere up there. He's a retired Marine Corps gunny, and after retirement, he got really interested in American KIAs and MIAs, and he put together quite a database. And he's been doing a lot of research on some of the MIA cases from World War II. And he's the one that told me that there are 69 unknowns from the Battle of Saipan that are buried in the American Memorial Cemetery in Manila. And this will figure into one or more of the cases that I'm going to discuss here shortly. So if you want to move on. And this photograph on the left, if you're a student of the Battle of Saipan, it's rather iconic. You'll see it in a lot of articles and books written about the Battle of Saipan. Now, one of the Marines that I interviewed for my book on Saipan was Carl Matthews. He was from Texas. He lied about his age to go into the Marine Corps even before Pearl Harbor. I think he was 16 years old. He was sent down to America Samoa right after Pearl Harbor. He's with the 5th Marine Brigade reinforced because they thought the Japanese were going to try to take the Pongo down there. Anyway, he got some tropical disease and was sent home to recover. And when he did recover, he's made part of the 4th Marine Division and saw action for the first time in the Marshall Islands. And then after that, they went back to Hawaii to regroup, and their next landings were on Saipan. Now, Carl had died some years ago, but he was pretty sure that he's in that photograph. So somebody did a little Photoshop on it. And if you look at the photo on the right, he said once he saw that, he was 100% convinced that the guy on the left is him. That's on 15 June 1944 when they landed on Saipan. And the guy holding the BAR to his right is Wendell Nightingale. And on the other photo to the left, the guy standing up just behind Carl, that was Stanley Leary. He was a freshly minted second lieutenant in the Marine Corps who joined the 4th Marine Division when they were still in Hawaii. So that was his first taste of combat. But later in the campaign on Saipan, Wendell Nightingale was killed in a firefight on the east side of the island. And this is an example of where they knew he was killed, but they had to keep moving because it was pretty hot and heavy there. And they left him for Graves registration to recover his body and notify his family. That was KIA. But for whatever reason, his family was notified that he was missing in action. We don't know even what happened to his body. It may be one of the 69 unknowns at the American Memorial Cemetery in Manila. We don't know. But for a long time, I was in contact with one of Wendell's younger brothers, and he says to that very day, they just still have him listed as missing in action. Although Carl and some of the buddies who survived the war later made contact with the family, say, hey, he was killed. We know that, but we don't know what happened to the body. Now we can move on to the next one. This is Lieutenant Stanley Leary. I just mentioned him. He's a freshly minted second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. He joined the 4th Marine Division after the Marshall Islands when they were back in Hawaii. Carl Matthews was made his runner, so they were glued at the hip from the beginning until the end. They survived the fighting right up until the end of the fighting on Saipan about 2.5 weeks later. They're up there, up on high ground, overlooking a flat area to the west. Carl was standing there with Lieutenant Leary when shots rang out and Stanley Leary was killed. Carl scrambled back out of the way, and 2 other Marines trying to retrieve the body were also shot and killed. So they had to leave the bodies there. But again, here was a situation where the body, if it was recovered, we don't know when or if or how. The family was notified, though, that he was killed in action. Carl was later wounded there on Saipan. He was sent home. He was still in the Marine Corps, but given light duty. And anyway, Stanley Leary's family tracked him down because they wanted to know the details of how he died. And so they remained friends for as long as his parents were alive. Now we can go on to the next slide.
Hang on, bear with me. There we go. Yep.
Yeah, this is the old Japanese jail on Saipan. It's pretty much in ruin. There were a couple of American fighter pilots that were held there because the softening up began, I think it was around the 11th of June, with carrier aircraft bombing and strafing the place. And actually, it was before that, I think it was either April or May, there was a B-24 photo reconnaissance mission that was flown over Saipan and Kenya, and one of the B-24s was shot down. It was about 4 of the crew survived, and they were picked up and held in the jail. I know this because I interviewed one Manny T. Sablon, who was a messenger boy. He was a local, Chamorro. He was a messenger boy for the Japanese police. And he told me in his oral history interview that he had access to the jail. And he saw these American flyers there, and he was told, though, when they were removed from the jail, they were going to be sent back to Japan. Well, the problem is we don't know if they made it back to Japan. I suspect not. Very possible they were taken out and executed, because that was the fate of a lot of flyers, especially towards the last year or 2 of the war. At the same time, a lot of ships trying to bring reinforcements to the islands were being sunk by American submarines, which are right off the coast there. And a lot of Japanese civilians who were trying to be evacuated, they never made it back to Japan either for the same reason. So we really don't know if they made it or not. But at the same time, just before the Marines landed, 2 fighter pilots were shot down over the island and held here. One of them had been wounded, and Manny T. Sablon said one of them was later killed by friendly fire, and the other one was taken out and executed just as the Marines were landing on the coast. Now, if we go to the next slide. This is a photograph of a group of Americans who were in a B-24 that was shot down over the Marshall Islands in October of 43, I think it was. This is again according to Ted Darcy. Now, in the photograph, you can't see it very well, but they were wearing little wooden signs with Japanese written on it. But according to Ted Darcy, soon after this photograph was taken, they were all taken out and executed. Now, the interesting thing is, though, when the Marines got up to where the jail was and they found the remains of this pilot, he was wearing a flight jacket that had the name J.J. Perry stamped in it. And according to Ted Darcy, there's only one J.J. Perry in his database, and he was on supposedly on the B-24 that was shot down over the Marshalls. So it's a bit of a mystery as to who that body really belonged to. It's very possible, though, that according to Ted Darcy, that J.J. Perry was a radio operator, and there were instances where radio operators, if captured, they were interrogated and used to monitor U.S. radio traffic. And there was a wireless station on Saipan. So that's one possibility, but this is all hypothetical. We don't know. We just know that there was a body there. He had a flight jacket on, had J.J. Perry stenciled in it. So it's one of those mysteries that have yet to be solved. Ted Darcy says he's been in contact with the Perry family, but it's still a mystery to them too. So we can go on to the next slide.
Just before we do, it strikes me, Bruce, that this is we said at the beginning, this is very much a different discipline to studying battles, because you kind of have to use a bit of, obviously detective work, but hunches and your own instincts as to what may or may not be true, because as you just said yourself there, you can't prove anything. I mean, there's even a possibility that someone else, another person, was wearing Perry's jacket when he was killed. I mean, leather jackets, if it was an aviator's jackets, they can be quite prized. So at what point do you kind of think, okay, I can take this case as far with hard facts, but beyond this, it is just kind of speculation. It is, you're being very clear today that you say we don't know. But do you kind of have a rule within yourself that, okay, this is what I know, and then beyond this, it is something I can't really quantify?
That's right. And there's a lot of speculation going on. I've discussed this in the past with Ted Darcy, and he's saying, well, this is what I do know, and this is what I don't know. This is a possibility. Well, that's a possibility. And then we just have to leave it at that until we can come up with something a little bit more solid. So if we can move on to the next one. But, if there's over 70,000 Americans still listed as missing in action, there must be 1 million more Japanese. Because it was only back in the 60s or 70s that they were allowed back into some of these islands to recover their dead. Basically, that's what they did. There were something like almost 30,000 Japanese died on Saipan. Yeah. And they were buried in mass graves. A lot of them didn't have any identity. I was out there some years ago with a Japanese group. They found some of the mass graves left over from the Gyokusai, or what you would refer to as a bonsai charge, that took place in July of 1944, as the Japanese knew the game was up. And when they counted the bodies afterwards, they counted over 4,000. It was July, it's summer. So they built these big trenches and just shoved them in there. And then back in, I think it was 1994, 95, when they're building a hotel in the area, they came across all of these, when they're digging test holes near the village of Echugo, they came up with all these skeletal remains. So they called in the Japanese consulate, and we put together a team and excavated, trying to recover some of them. But you couldn't identify them. They're just bones. If you go to the next slide. Now, here's an example. If you look at that photograph on the left, that was taken in 1944 after the Gyokusai. It's not a really good photograph. But if you look closely there, to the right of that photograph, there's a bulldozer. And they're digging this trench. And again, you can't see very well, but to the left of the bulldozer, these are bodies that were then dumped into the trench and covered up. That was not the only trench. There were a lot of them, but we uncovered a couple of them. We extracted what we think may be close to 500 remains, but over 4,000 were counted after the Gyokusai. And these are some of we call bone hunters, who came down, volunteers from Japan. And so I was working with them in part of the excavation, and then I took them out into the jungle where I had found other skeletal remains for them to recover. And now, back in 1995, when this was discovered, we did this in reverse. We got a bulldozer out there and scraped off the soil until we started hitting bones. Then we went in with hand tools to recover them. I might also add later, I went back a couple of years later because when they were doing some more excavations, they found the individual graves of some Americans from the 27th Infantry Division who had been buried out there, separate from the mass burial, because both the 2nd and the 4th Marine Division and the 27th Infantry Division, U.S. Army, they had separate cemeteries on the southwest end of the island, which later they were exhumed, most of them, and taken back to Arlington or wherever the families wanted them. But for whatever reason, there were some individuals from the 27th Infantry Division who were buried there at the site of the Gilkasai. And when we found the remains, they had their dog tags and other things. And so here we were 65 years later, we were able to notify the families that we had found the remains of their loved ones. So that's one success story. So
and there are people in the sidebar saying it's fantastic that people like yourself and these other organizations are doing this work, because it's not like there's, as you said, there's not like just a few out there. There's tens of thousands out there missing of the Allies alone, not counting the Japanese. And it's very easy in some ways to kind of just think, well, World War II is 80 years in the past now, or 79 from 1945. Tie a ribbon on it, put it in a box. It's all in the past now. But I say it's still there in terms of these remains being discovered and missing, and the stories without an end. So thank you very much for your sterling work.
And there's still families that might be, it might not be, not to be the parents, but they're the grandchildren and stuff. They're still interested. And I'll get into more of that as we move along. But anyway, this is what the Japanese did. This fire, this is at the north end of Saipan. That was an old fighter strip that was built out there. And they just took the bones, they cremated them, and then took them back to, I don't even want to try to pronounce the name of the cemetery, but it's in Tokyo. And that's where the remains of Japanese war dead are taken, even to this day as they find them. Then we can go on to the next slide. Now, this one is close to me because this is Woody Lackland McVeigh. He was a F-6F Hellcat fighter pilot off my old ship, USS Yorktown. Yorktown was an Essex-class fast carrier. It was commissioned in 1943. I served on it during the Vietnam War. To give a little history here, after the bloodbath Tarawa, the next operation was in Marshalls, which went much smoother. We had fewer casualties. The idea was to take just a couple of islands in the Marshalls that were not heavily defended by the Japanese, which is something we didn't do when we took Tarawa. Tarawa was a real bloodbath for the 2nd Marine Division. So we took Kwajalein, Majuro. We pretty much bypassed all the other islands in the Marshalls, but we sent our Admiral Spoons was in charge of that. And he sent Admiral Mark Mishner with his fast carriers out to neutralize some of the other islands so the Japanese couldn't try to come back, especially those islands that had airstrips on it. And then they decided to move further west and take a crack at Chuuk Island, which was the main Japanese naval base in the area. And that's almost as an afterthought. This is, I think it was February 1944, about 4 months prior to the Marines and Army landing on Saipan. Mark Mitchell had the idea, says, well, I'm close enough. Why don't we go up there and take a crack at Saipan and Tinian? So he took his fast carriers up there. They launched a number of planes and strafed and bombed the place. And during this quick operation, 7 planes were lost off the fast carriers. One of them actually crash landed back on one of the carriers. But Woody Lackland McVeigh and his wingman were 2 of the other 6 that didn't make it back. Now, when I was researching my book on Saipan back in the 90s, you could only get so much information off the internet. So I was writing to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, telling them what I was doing, asking if they had any information on this or that. And they were just sending me boxes of stuff. A lot of it I couldn't use, but I kept it anyway because it was interesting. But one of the really interesting things that they sent me was the autopsy report on Woody Lackland McVeigh, because he was reported as missing as an action. 4 months later, as the Marines of the 2nd Marine Division moved up the west coast towards the main village of Garapan, some locals said, hey, there's an American flyer buried over here in the American cemetery. So they got a surgeon and a team to exhume the remains. They identified him because he still had clothing with his name stenciled on it. And they, of course, they had dental records. So he was no longer missing in action. He was confirmed killed in action, but the family was never notified.
Mm.
A body was misplaced. We don't.
I mean, that's the rub, isn't it? Because there was a case in Normandy where I live just recently where a person has finally been buried as the American he always was, but he had been misidentified and buried as an unknown in a German cemetery, and it took a long time to sort it all out. But the fact is, with the millions of people that were in the services in World War II and the tens of millions of documents going back and forth across huge distances, of course, clerical human errors were made. Things just got filed incorrectly and people got lost in the system. And yet, as you said earlier, Bruce, that means families don't know or were misinformed about something. I mean, you can forgive the fact the military makes mistakes as an organization, but the human impact is unfortunately very tragic.
Well, that's not the end of the story, Paul, either.
Indeed.
Because I was not working on MIA issues. I was still working on my book about Saipan, but I was in contact with Ted Darcy later. So I made a copy of this autopsy report. And I said, hey, Ted, this is what I have, but I'm working on something else. He took that autopsy report. He spent the next 3 years researching what happened to Woody Lackland McVeigh. And guess what? He found him. He was at the American Memorial Cemetery in Manila. He notified DPAA. They got involved. They identified him as his. His wife was still alive. And other family members were still alive. His wife had remarried. Apparently he had a daughter. I don't think he even met his daughter, but she had died at some young age. So what I did is I wrote an article about this. And I ran it by Ted. I said, do you see any, did I get this right? I also made contact with one of his granddaughters who never knew him. That's another story. But anyway, the Naval History magazine published it. And 65 years later, after he had gone missing, they had a funeral for him. Mm-hmm. So that is one of the success stories. Let's put it that way. And the other thing is, we don't know what happened to his wingman. They were both lost on the same day, but we don't know what happened to him.
And that when you sent me the article, the tragedy of completing half the story, but then the wingman is still out there, is, I guess, that's typical of exactly what this kind of work is. For every success story, there are 9, 10 where there's still no solution. But I guess that's the nature of the beast in this case.
Exactly. Now, if we can move on, I don't want to keep your audience up too late tonight. But now here's another one. The guy in the center, he was the pilot of an Avenger off Gambia Bay, which was a CVE. The guy on the right, Bacon, was from Oregon. He was an orphan. I had made contact with a friend of his from high school. And Howard Rivers on the far left was from Ohio, and I'm still in contact with his family. Now, this is on 17 June, 2 days after the Marines and the Army had landed. They were ordered to take off and bomb a suspected Japanese bomb ammunition dump near Tanapeg Harbor. Well, that's Tanapeg Harbor in the photo off your life. And I lived just above that. That's where our house was. Apparently, in the process of dropping the bomb, they took an anti-aircraft shell to bomb bay. The plane caught on fire. Marines near the village of Garapan to the south said they saw 2 parachutes open. Now, Holloman, and I'm still in contact with Holloman's son, he managed to crash land his Avenger on the reef out there. You can see that in the photograph on the right. He was badly burned, and it took a while before he was rescued, but the war was over for him. But we never found the remains of Jack Bacon and Howard Rivers. Now, Going back a ways, I had contact with somebody. I was telling him the story, and he says, well, I have a friend nearby. He was a Navy photographer's mate off one of the carriers, and he was sent ashore after Saipan was declared secure, and his assignment was to take photographs of the bodies of Americans who were captured and executed by the Japanese. As far as I know, no Americans captured there during the battle survived. Apparently, a lot of them were severely tortured before being executed. So I was talking to him on the phone. I said, well, how many of them did you find? He says, I don't remember. There were a lot of them. But this is typical when I'm trying to interview people who had horrific experiences. They spent a lifetime trying to forget this stuff. And then somebody like me comes along and asks them to remember. And he was getting a bit emotional on the phone as we got into it because he was trying to put that stuff behind him. This is 60 years. And so we had to, I knew then I had to stop. I learned from past experience when people start breaking down, remembering stuff they want to forget, I have to stop.
Yeah.
But I'm still in contact with Howard Rivers' niece. She's back in Ohio. I told her about the podcast too. I said, I'm going to be talking about your uncle here. They still don't know what happened to him. Ted Darcy, I gave him this information about these photographs. He went back to Naval Historical Society or someplace trying to find that stuff, but he couldn't find anything. So we can move on. Oh, Patrick Renfriends. Now, this is very typical. In a lot of homes where somebody was killed or went missing, there's sort of a special corner in the house. It's almost like a shrine.
Yeah.
There's a photograph of this person who never came back. Now, he was born after the war. He grew up at family gatherings like Thanksgiving or Christmas and hearing stories about this uncle of his who was on a B-24 on a bombing mission against Yap Island, and it never came back. So when he is later as an adult, he decided he would go out to Yap and see if he could find his father's B-24. He's still going back all these years later. He's never found his father or his uncle's B-24, but he's come across other wreck sites. And he's made contact with the families of other crew members. And he put together this web site called Missing Aircrew. And it's full of information about his uncle, the squadron, the crew members. It's really worth looking at. He's been involved with the Historic Preservation Office out there, and they set up this sort of a historic trail with all these photographs. People can go and visit it and get some ideas to what happened. Because Yap, even though it was scheduled to be invaded, it was one of those islands that they decided, let's bypass it and just bomb it and keep everybody's heads down. He's still working on it. He still goes out to Yap. It's probably something he'll be doing until the day he dies. We can move on to the next slide. Project Recovery. Now, I was at, I think I just come back from Saipan. There was the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. The symposium that year was, the title was D-Days in the Pacific. So I went out there. My book about Saipan had just come out. And there's a Dr. Pat Scannon. He was from California, matter of fact. He lived about 20 minutes drive down the road from where I used to live in California. He had a copy of my book. Somebody told him I was there. He came up with one of his colleagues, introduced himself. So we've been in contact ever since. Now, he got interested in this issue. Him and his wife went out to the POW Islands to go scuba diving. They were out there to look at pretty fish and corals and stuff like that. But they got there, they found the wing of a plane out there. And he just said, whoa, what's this? How did this get here? Who flew it? And from that point on, he forgot about pretty fish and coral. And he got some friends together, and they would go out there, and they were wreck hunting in the POW Islands.
Wow.
And they found a lot of wreck sites. And they started working with DPAA. They still do work with DPAA. And one of the one of the people working with him, Dan O'Brien, he's a cinematographer. And over a 7-year period of going back there every year for about a month, I think it was, he was documenting what they were doing and what they were finding. And when I would give this lecture on cruise ships, I would follow it up in the afternoon with this documentary. It's called The Last Flight Home, about what they were doing out there. Now, a couple of years ago, by the way, you can find that on YouTube. You can watch it for free, The Last Flight Home. But now they put together, I guess there was a film company in Hollywood. They went out there and updated what he'd been doing, because they've expanded beyond the POW Islands. They've been looking for MIA all over the world. They put that together, and it's called, what was it called? To What Remains. It's about an hour and 20 minutes. So now I give my lecture in the morning, and I show this documentary. I have permission from the film company out there to show that, because it's good publicity for them. But if I don't want to linger too far here, but you can probably go on Google and type in Project Recovery and find all sorts of additional information. Matter of fact, if interested, I can contact Dr. Scannon and see if he might want to do a podcast for you. So.
Sounds good.
Okay, we can go on to the next slide. And of course, I have to mention DPAA. I network with them. I'm friends with a lot of the historians, especially, and some of them are just focused on certain areas. Like one of them is focused on the Mariana Islands. Another friend of mine out there, he's focused on the Solomon Islands. Another one's focused on Malaysia. Another on Papua New Guinea. And they literally go out there for months at a time if they have something. Like if some locals say, hey, we found a wreck site out in the jungle. Now, when I was researching this, I had come across information that said there were probably more missing aircraft in the greater Papua New Guinea area than any place else in the world. The estimate is between 500 and 600 aircraft went missing in this area. And most of them are from World War II. Okay. And if you've ever been to Papua New Guinea, I was just there last year. I mean, it hasn't changed much. It's rugged mountains, steep valleys, malaria-infested jungle. But then I also read a few years ago, but there are even more missing aircraft in the Himalayas, because they were flying the hump between India. And the people who flew the hump referred to it as the aluminum trail. And at least according to what I had read, there were about 700 aircraft went down in the Himalayas during World War II. So we've got a lot of work to do out there. So, but I have to mention DPAA. And now we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, hang on. There we go.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about a little bit about the Australians. If you look on the photograph on the left, the fellow with the beard, that's a friend of mine from New Zealand. His name is David Flynn. He's lived in Papua New Guinea area for over 50 years. He's an engineer. He went out there, married a local, started a family, but he really knows a lot about the World War II in that area. He's a licensed salvage diver. He's dived a lot of the wrecks in the islands, especially there in Simpson Harbor, because he's until recently lived in Rabaul. He's found a lot of wrecks out into the jungle. And the fellow in the middle, that is Jim Burrows. He is the last surviving member of the Australian coastwatchers from World War II. Matter of fact, I just got an email from his son less than 2 weeks ago. At the age of 101, he just died. Okay. Now, he was in the Baning Mountains above Rabaul during the last 15 months of the war. As soon as the war was over, they got him out of there, because if you look at the picture in the middle, Robert Burrows, that's his older brother who was part of Lark Force. This is about a 1,400-man Australian team that was sent to Rabaul, supposedly to protect the place from the Japanese. Well, the Japanese landed in January with about 8,000 men. They didn't have a chance. A lot of them were killed. Some of them headed off into the jungle. Some of them surrendered at Toll Plantation further up the coast. They were immediately taken out and executed. Others managed to get on a small boat and escape back to Port Moresby and then eventually to Australia. But he was one of approximately 1,000 Australians, both military and civilian, who were put aboard the Montevideo Maru. Now, supposedly, I can't confirm this, but they were going to be sent to Hainan Island, and they were going to be exchanged for some Japanese that had been interned in Australia. Well, an American submarine, not knowing that there were about 1,000 Australians on there, planted a torpedo into the Montevideo Maru and went down in about 15 minutes. All these Australians were locked in the holes and were not, nobody let them out. So they went down with it. It's only a couple of years ago that they found the Montevideo Maru, but of course, it's considered a war grave. And so there will be no attempt to get the bodies out. Now, that's not the end of the story, because he had a twin brother, Thomas Burroughs. He was flying a Bofors, a flight of 5, I think it was Bofors, off Woodnow Island. They were going to bomb Japanese airstrip on the south coast of New Britain at Gazmata. They never made it. All 5 planes disappeared. And they think they ran into some weather, and they all just went down someplace. So here are 3 brothers from one family in Australia. They all served in the military, and only one of them came home. The other 2 are still listed as missing in action. Now, if I can go to the next slide. This is one of the highest ranking MIAs from the Pacific War. His name was Kenneth Walker. I've been in contact with one of his sons, Douglas Walker. He was one of the shakers and movers between the wars. He was part of what they called the bomber mafia, had all these great ideas about, the bombers between World War I and World War II, how these big 4-engine bombers, they could go from point A to point B without any fighter escorts because they were bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. They could drop their load and come home safely. Well, it didn't work out that way, obviously. Now, in the early days of the war, we were trying to take the war to the Japanese. MacArthur, or General Kennedy's 5th Air Force under MacArthur, they didn't have much of an Air Force in the early days of the war down there in the Southwest Pacific. They had some B-17s and a few other planes, but they were sending them there just 1 or 2 or 3 at a time and trying to cause some damage in Rabaul. And Kenneth Walker was one of these hands-on leaders. He didn't like to send these young kids out on these dangerous missions while he stayed back in Port Moresby or wherever. So he went out on these missions with them. But when General Kennedy found out about it, he ordered him to stop doing it. You know too much. If you get captured, they'll torture you and you'll spill the beans. And he said, not only that, he said, I want you to stop sending daylight bombing missions up there until we get more of an Air Force. You're going up there today, and a lot of these planes are just not making it back. Well, he disobeyed both orders. We went up on a mission. The best we can tell, talking from David Flynn, is that they came in from the north and came south, dropped their bombs around Rabaul, and took off. One of the engines, this is according to David Flynn, was knocked out by anti-aircraft fire, and then the B-17 with Walker on board was shot down by a Japanese fighter plane. Douglas Walker is still really interested in trying to find his father's B-17, the San Antonio Rose, it was called. Now, David Flynn thinks it might be, I don't have a pointer, but down near Wide Bay or on the other side of the Banning Mountains, there are a number of aircraft in there. They know there's a couple of B-17s, but there's a Chinese logging company up there, and they don't like people snooping around, so they hire some locals to chase people away. They have no interest in missing aircraft, MIA issues. So what they do, if they come across an aircraft when they're logging, they simply bulldoze it out of the way. So we can go to the next photograph. Next slide. Yeah, this is Dave and his wife, Kate. Like I said, he's lived there for over 50 years. He sent all of his children to Australia once they graduated from high school. And he's about my age. So they're right now in the process of moving down. As a matter of fact, he's supposed to be visiting me here any day now. But they tried to set up a museum for all this stuff that they've been finding in the jungle and in the waters around there. And they have this, it's an old German social club, but they've turned it into sort of a museum, but you can see a photograph of a tail of a Japanese plane there. And there's some other artifacts in there too, but they really need something a little bit more substantial. But trying to get the PNG government to help them out with it is just
it's complicated there, isn't it? It's really complicated.
So we can go to the next slide. Anyway, this is another photograph. He thinks that possibly the tail section that I showed you in an early photograph may have been the plane that shot down Walker's plane, because it was also shot down in the same area. But that's the problem. Chinese loggers, they just buy off the politicians and stuff, and they can go on, they can just rip the place apart. They don't have to answer to anybody. And then you got the Asian scrap metal dealers. They'll take that stuff and turn it into tin cans. Next slide. I bring up Verdun because, well, you live in France. Verdun has absolutely nothing to do with World War II in the Pacific. It has nothing to do with World War II.
Not much. Tenuous link there, Bruce. Yeah.
Yeah. I use this as a compare and contrast, because if you've ever been to Verdun, and I've been there at least 3 times over the last 30 or 40 years, but they have this monument there and all the war graves all around. But on the ground level, too, as you walk around, there's this ossuary of these plexiglass. You can walk in, and talking to one of the historians there, he says they think these are the remains of at least 160,000 individuals. I don't know if they're French or they're German or what. And they're still coming up when they perform public works projects in the area. They're still coming up with unexploded ordnance and human remains. So I use this. Matter of fact, also, if you go walk through the battlefield of Verdun with a magnetic compass, you cannot find magnetic north, because there's still so much iron in the earth from all the unexploded shells. But I'm thinking, well, if there's 100, maybe 100, the remains of 160,000 people, these are all MIAs, right? From one battle that lasted, what, 10 months, where something like 1 million people were killed, and nothing, they just slaughtered each other. They stood there and slaughtered each other for 10 months. Now, my wife is from France, and I'm talking to one of her uncles when we were on our way to Verdun. He informed me that, no, it was years ago when her paternal grandparents were still alive. When we said we were going to Verdun then, her grandfather said, well, my father was killed at Verdun. Matter of fact, his father and several brothers died in Verdun. I don't think there's a family in France that has not been.
Yeah, pretty much in France, everyone knows someone who was killed at Verdun, really. Yeah.
So I like to use Verdun as sort of compare and contrast. If there are over 70,000 Americans still listed as missing in action from World War II alone in this one battle, twice that many maybe. So that's the only reason I put Verdun in there. But you can go to the next slide. Okay, this is Taranaki, where I live. That's Mount Taranaki, a dormant volcano, not extinct, but dormant. Anyway, I live a little bit out of the picture down there. But I think from my research, I think it's fair to say that most of the aircraft lost during World War II were operational losses. They were not combat losses, because they were building planes so fast and training people so fast to fly them that literally, like, for example, I interviewed a fellow who flew B-24s during World War II. He said, look, they taught me how to take off. They taught me how to land. And after that, I either had to learn the rest on my own, or I wouldn't survive. Well, obviously hit. But here in just New Plymouth, where I live, they had a training base outside of town. It was a grass strip then. And any number of aircraft went missing just in the foothills around here. This one disappeared. It was an Oxford. It disappeared in 1943. They thought maybe it crashed in the Tasman Sea because nobody could find it. Well, in 1974, a goat hunter in the foothills there came across the crash site. And it still had the skeletal remains of the crew. And on the far right, there's a technical museum nearby, and they have parts to the plane that they found. So even though New Zealand was not a combat zone, they lost a lot of planes and air crews just from accidents. And it was like that all over from my research anyway. Next. And there's MIA recovery versus relic hunters because there's money to be made
Yep.
from that. Matter of fact, at Ardmore, which is near Auckland, there's an old airstrip. There's a private airstrip now for small planes, but there's still a lot of Quonset huts. And I went there because there's a guy there who's buying a lot of old airplane parts. People would go and find these, and he would buy them, and then he'd sell them to collectors in the States. And so he gave me a tour, and then I said, well, what happens? So do you try to identify the aircraft? Do you know if the people who brought this in, were there any human remains? Because, those are considered war graves. And the guy cut me off right there. He threw me out.
In Eastern Europe as well. There's all sorts of people digging up from Belarus and Estonia and places like that. They're digging up German helmets and gear, and it's just being sold on. And archaeology is solid and a part of our understanding of history, but it's grave robbing essentially, isn't it?
Well, especially if it's a crash site and they're not making any effort to identify it. If there's any skeletal remains, human remains, they're just discarded because there's money to be made in this stuff. Why wait for DPA to come out in a couple of years so then you can, whatever. Anyway, we can go to the next slide. This is usually where I wrap up my lecture if I'm only given 45 minutes, and I just like to include some of the people I network. This is not all of them, believe me. If your subscribers want to go to my website, under links, there's a number of other people involved in these issues. Peter Dunn is in Brisbane, Australia, and he has a fantastic site called Oz at War. So if you're interested in anything about Australia in the Pacific War, he's the man. Justin Talon, PacificRex.com. He's got a fantastic database of information. He also has a search engine, so you can look up.
Seemed to spend his life in the Philippines and moving around. Follow him on Facebook. Yeah, amazing guy.
Oh, you know him. Okay, yeah. And then I mentioned Ted Darcy. Okay. And then we have Pat Scannon at the bottom, but those are just a couple. Now,
we'll carry on because more to do.
Yep. Okay, we got a couple more in here then, since if we have the time. Now, I'm going to take you for some New Zealand MIAs from the Gilbert Islands. And that's what the arrow was pointing there, the yellow arrow. Gilbert Islands is just to the north of New Zealand, and we can go to the next slide. Now, one of the people I interviewed, and I wrote an article about him that was published in World War II magazine, John Jones. He's the last of the Gilbert Island coastwatchers, because we know all about the Australian coastwatchers in the Solomon Islands. But, New Zealanders, they had their coastwatchers too. They were in the Gilbert Islands. They were at Pitcairn Island. They were in some of the islands down towards the Antarctic. Originally, they were sent out there to watch for German raiders. This is before Pearl Harbor. Now, John Jones, he was 90 years old when I interviewed him, and he was the last survivor. They went by boat from Fiji to Tarawa, which was in the southern part of the Gilberts. And they dropped off a number of Australians. I think there were a couple of Brits in there. What they did was they go to these little atolls, and these guys were all radio operators. And they went along and they had a soldier with just a rifle. Not so much to protect them, but to keep them company, I think, at least according to John Jones. Now, after they dropped off these 17 on Tarawa, they went on further north up to Macon and Butari Tari. So right after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved down to the northern Gilberts and seized John Jones and 6 others. They were among the first POWs, Allied POWs post Pearl Harbor, and they were sent to the Zensuji POW camp in Japan. They spent the rest of the war up there being used as slave labor. I say him and his 6 comrades were lucky because they weren't treated well, but they survived. All the others didn't. If you go to the next slide. Now, this is a photograph that John Jones took of some of his colleagues when they dropped them off at Tarawa. Now, later, I think it was October 40. It was later that the Japanese came all the way south and seized Tarawa. And for whatever reasons, they kept these coast watchers there. They didn't send them back to Japan right away. And then I think it was 1943. I think it was the USS Portland. It was a cruiser that had just escorted a damaged ship back to Pearl Harbor. On the way back to Solomons, they swung by Tarawa and shelled the place. Okay. And like they had a float plane that strafed some watercraft there in the lagoon. In retaliation, the Japanese took all 17 of these coast watchers out one at a time and decapitated them. And this was the Marines, when they took the place in November 1943, they knew what happened to them because a local who'd survived the fighting was a witness to what happened to these coast watchers. At the same time, according to some information I came across, the Americans said, we can send a submarine and get those guys out of there before it's too late. And supposedly the New Zealand military said, no, these guys are sort of a tripwire. We want to leave them so they can let us know when the Japanese are coming. So anyway, as a result, they lost their lives. To this very day, the remains have still not been recovered. We can go on to the next. And this is a memorial after the 2nd Marine Division. And the 2nd Marine Division had spent quite a bit of time in New Zealand. In fact, they had a pretty nice war up until November 43 when they went into battle at Tarawa, where they had 3,000 casualties. But after Tarawa was secured, the Marines put up this memorial to the coast watchers who were executed there by the Japanese. It's been replaced a couple of times since then because a lot of this has just deteriorated over the years. Next photograph. This is just a Qantas Empire flying boat. A couple of them, back in the day, these were passenger planes. I remember giving this lecture to Australians and they would say, well, when I was a kid, I remember watching them take off and land in Sydney Harbor. Well, a lot of these people were in the Royal Australian Air Force Reserves. And so these Qantas flying, Empire flying boats were made part of the Royal Australian Air Force. And some of them were chartered by the U.S. military as we were retreating from the Philippines down to the Dutch East Indies. They chartered some of these flying boats and others to get their diplomats and military person out of there, including Dutch diplomats and their families. Well, one of them was shot down near, I think it was near Timor. It crash landed near the beach. There were survivors. They were eventually rescued. And then another one, though, on the way down to Darwin, just never made it. And the reason I got interested in that, because on a Princess cruise, when I gave this lecture, a woman came up and she said, her father was from New Zealand. He was a pilot. He moved to Australia so he could further his flying career with Qantas. And he was on one of those flying boats that never made it back. She got a hold of me a couple of years later and said, there was an aviation historian from Australia, Phil Fabra, who's mentioned there, and a Japanese aviation historian. They collaborated, and the Japanese historian found some archival material that proved beyond proof that a Betty bomber flying out of Bali actually intercepted that Empire flying boat and shot it down. So at least she knew after all this time where her father ended up. We can go on to the next one. And this came up only a couple of years ago. Again, when I gave this lecture, I can't remember, it was on a Viking cruise or whatever, but a woman came up to me and she says, I had an uncle who was flying in a PBY Catalina. They were on, it was 1944. They were flying over the west end of Papua New Guinea. They were going to drop mines somewhere in the Philippines, and they never came back. And then a few years ago, some loggers there in PNG, they came across this wreck site. They called the Indonesian military. They identified it as Australian. They notified the Australians. The Australians came up there. They identified it as Catalina A24-50, and that was the PBY that her uncle disappeared on. So I keep getting new stuff coming in, but I only have so much time to give my lecture. So I have to take something out if I want to put something else new in. Now, I'm not sure. I think that might be the last in this.
That's the last one. Yeah, yeah. No,
Okay.
and it's what I'm thinking as you've been talking, Bruce, is that you are covering just a handful of stories, and yet there are tens of thousands. It's a kind of a grounding listening to you that we're studying this war, but for many it's essentially still going on. If you're a family of one of these people, it's never ended. And yeah, so thank you very much for sharing this stuff with us.
Well, the Naval History magazine years ago, she asked me if one of the editors asked me if I had enough material to do an article about the missing in action in the Pacific War. I said, I have enough material to write articles for the next 50 years.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that was a little bit more than they were looking for, so I never heard back from them after that.
Well, it's been brilliant talking to you, Bruce. People were not asking questions because you were just covering everything so well. So we'll invite you back a third time. We'll discuss, put our heads together about what we can come and do. I know you want to suggest the idea of doing a sort of a introduction to the Pacific War. That's a possibility, but we'll definitely have you back. Folks, I am back later today, 5 p.m. UK time. We have Steve coming on talking about the 1st Division on Omaha Beach. But right now, we'll say thank you to Bruce. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Click like and subscribe. Definitely leave a comment after the show. Go and check out Bruce's website. The description is in the link is in the description below. Check out his other content and YouTube and stuff. There's lots of information, amazing stuff there. So, folks, see you all later. It's Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying thanks for your time. Bye.